Welcome, everybody, to the launch of Disability History Month 2025, and the theme Disability, Life and Death, and which I think most people will think fairly appropriate, but I will explain why. Perhaps to just say this is the 16th Disability History Month, and when we set it up, there were 80 organisations came together. Some of them still support, but not many send us much money. We decided to be doing three things with this month, and it runs until the 20th of December. First of all, to celebrate our lives, and we've got lots of that going on here tonight, challenging disableism, particularly through the historical lens of how it developed, and we're doing that as well, and what we still need to do to achieve equality, of which we have a long way to go, perhaps more than this time last year if we look at the global situation, certainly. But we must not be put off by these things. It is the fact that we can actually have this discussion here is quite important, because the majority of countries in the world now are not democratic. I heard from a talk given by the Prime Minister of Barbados when I was there a few weeks ago. She identified there are 91 undemocratic countries who don't really have a separation of powers between the executive, the legislature, and the legal system, don't have freedom of the press. And there are 89 that do, though none of them are perfect. And without that, then ordinary citizens don't really have much say in the running of their country. So we are pleased that we can still hold this meeting and do these things that we are doing. So why disability, life and death? Well, obviously, we've had a number of things this year which have led, with the new government, we have the hangover of austerity, which has been killing people throughout that period, particularly disabled people. But we've also had the first thing that they did was to take away the winter fuel allowance, which would have led to people dying, particularly who couldn't move around because they couldn't afford their fuel. We think it's coming back now, so that's quite good. The second thing that happened was that we had the attack on PIP, as if that was going to get people into work, which of course it isn't. And we've got a speaker on that, and we'll be explaining it. Was defeated by the democratic process, largely by disabled people lobbying Labour MPs, so that in the end 126 of them voted against the government, which put pay to that proposal, though we don't think it's gone away. And then we've had throughout this time assisted suicide, which is morally perhaps more difficult, but I have to say that of all the disabled people's organisations in the country, not a single one is in favour of it. There are lots of individuals who are in favour of it, but we are talking as a movement who analyse what's happening to us, just as the women's movement or the black people's movement have challenged it, who don't comprise the majority of those populations. They're the people who do the thinking. And so we align ourselves with those movements. Can I have the next slide, please? Thomas Bush is helping me tonight, so thank you. So are our lives valued equally as they're meant to be? Well, certainly, just looking at four things that have been going on in the last few years, 2/3 of all deaths in COVID were disabled people, when we are 22% of the population, so 3 times as many deaths during COVID. And people will have heard stories about do not resuscitate notices being put around, and the rationing of health services. And we've heard today from the inquiry that they started the lockdown at least a week late, which led to, they say, 22,000 extra people dying. And a good proportion of those would have been disabled people. So bad government had led to that situation. But there's a wider thing, which is, why is it that it always seems to be disabled people's lives that are valued less? So if we look at a piece of work done by Glasgow University on austerity and its impact on the UK population between 2013 and 2019. If you tracked it as if the normal demographic standards were operating as we expected, 300,000 more people died than was expected. And 60% of them were disabled people. So austerity killed, and it killed a lot of our population. Cases where disabled people are claiming benefits died or came to serious harm. The BBC say in an investigation there were 150 government reviews since 2012. People in the disability movement who are watching this more closely, and they said 82 deaths, it's averaging in the last couple of years around 80 deaths a year from suicide and people actually just starving because they don't have the provisions. And so the harshness that we see in the DWP and bringing in outside companies to do the work capability assessment and others has developed a real harshness towards people. Yet there are several million people who are entitled to those benefits who don't actually claim them, and we never hear about that. And last of all, over a longer period, going back to the eugenics movement, which we'll be talking about tonight, there were 140,000 people certified under the UK Mental Deficiency Act. Now, these were not people who were dangerous. These were not even people with severe mental health issues. They were not people who couldn't manage in society. They were just people who had a mild learning difficulty in the main. And 140,000 of them were either certified or indeed 80,000 were locked up. And most of them who were locked up there stayed there for the whole of their lives. And if you dig around these many places that were set up, you'll find unmarked graves or very smallly marked graves where most of them died. There were a few let out when care in the community came along, but by that time, 1920 to 1990, that a lot of people had passed. Okay, next slide, please. So it looks to us from that, just picking those four, that lives are not valued equally. What about people who've been successful as disabled people? Helen Keller, Stephen Hawkins, Judy Heumann, Albert Einstein, Harriet Tubman, now my brain's gone, the singer on the right there. We'll remember him in a moment. All well-known and achieved things. But under the programs of the eugenicists put to the most extreme, as operated in Nazi Germany from 1933 till 1945, all of these people would have been killed. Whether Albert would have been killed because he was a Jew or because he was neurodiverse, I'm not sure, because he's the one who doesn't appear on the list. But it is interesting that our lives do not seem to be as valued as other people's lives. And why is that? I think it stretches back thousands of years, and as we've looked at in previous Disability History Months, it is reinforced by myth, superstition, religions of all sorts, who do an othering process to disabled people. Sometimes they other us to the extent of making us almost saints, but mainly we're sinners, we're evil, we've done something wrong, or our parents did something wrong. We have karma affecting us. We have all sorts of things that impact on us. And mainly we get blamed for a lot of other things that go on. We are scapegoated, and that's been happening over and over in history. And of course, we understood at a time when people didn't understand how the world worked, but that any child in a primary school, even in a kindergarten now, knows more about how the body works than the most intellectual people 300 years ago. For instance, until Harvey came along, they didn't know there was a heart and a general circulation. I think every child of 3 or 4 knows that they've got a heart and blood is pumping around their body. So it's not surprising there was a lot of ignorance around, and ignorance led to people being scapegoated and blamed. Next slide, please. So we had witch hunts. where it's estimated around 6 million women were murdered across Europe, and this was to do with the battle with the Reformation between the Catholic and the Church of England and the other Protestant churches. When there were plagues in the period before that, often people who had an impairment, who were accepted in their communities, were suddenly picked on and accused of being the carrier of plague. Of course, wars led to people and continue to lead to a big number of people being permanently impaired. Austerity has, as we've just shown, did lead to a lot of not only increased impairment, but also deaths. Benefit cuts, natural disasters. We've just had COP30 ending, and there certainly seems to be no real sign of the leaders of the world grasping the nettle that if they don't do something very soon, we're going to have many more Jamaican hurricanes, many more places, particularly around the tropics, who pay for what the developed countries have done to the atmosphere. And that does lead to 10 times as many disabled people being impacted as other people in these disasters. So that if there isn't disaster preparedness and training all around the world, which seems difficult now because one of the main sources of funding for that was American aid, and 134 countries have had their projects cut. So the likelihood of more disabled people being marginalized and wiped out, not just around the world, but also in the United States itself, as federal funding has been cut to disabled people, to disabled children, to many other groups. And of course, COVID and other viruses will do this as well. So it does seem, to answer my question, are we impacted more? Yes, we are. And we're also blamed for it. This shouldn't actually be happening because the world came together 18, 19 years ago and agreed the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Next slide. Which says that state parties reaffirm that every human being has the inherent right to life and shall take all necessary measures to ensure its effective enjoyment by persons with disabilities. Article 10, very important. And the rest of it's interconnected, all of that convention. You can't opt out of one bit, you have to do the whole thing. We have 193 countries out of 198 in the world who have ratified this, or 197 in the world. But there are powerful business forces of the new right and the neo-fascist movement that is growing with populism that will undermine these rights. They'll start by attacking those who are marginalized most, those ethnically different, those from other countries, but they will inevitably attack us as they are already. And did you notice how when Pitt was defeated, people were flying kites around? How should they attack us next? And there was a big thing about taking away the mobility allowance, which allows people through a fleet system in the UK to actually have a Motability hired car, or a leased car, and gives people mobility. And if you say, well, why shouldn't that have been taken away? Surely all those barriers have gone. No, we were meant to have fully accessible buses, trains, all things by 2020 under the Equality Act. We're nowhere near that. And so people need to have their own mobility solutions, just as they need other solutions for the extra cost of being a disabled person, which Scope put this year at £1,070 a month. That's what Pitt was for, and that's what it should have been for, but the government managed to confuse everybody. So continual attacks on disabled people's rights and welfare, which is in the convention under Article 28 in the media, and no real attempts by government to actually change negative attitudes towards disabled people under Article 8. In fact, hate crime has gone up again towards us. Bullying has gone up towards us again in schools and so on. So this needs to be addressed. Next. There we are. Yeah, it was a moral panic. It started when Francis Galton, the cousin of Darwin, thought he could take Darwin's ideas of survival of the fittest, evolution and so on, and breed people like he bred racehorses or cattle. It was also encouraged in the press by the inferiority of our recruits in the Boer War, and this came up during the First World War as well, concerns about the mob, the poor, the feckless, the lack of control of slums, that the poor were outbreeding the rich, inadequacies of population wouldn't meet the requirements of the rich countries of the world to keep their empire going. So national tests concerned the portion of the population who were ineducable as education spread, and already locked away with the insane and the idiots. But then the concern was that group in between, which I've already mentioned, the feeble-minded, who had a high birth rate, often vagrant, alcoholic, and immoral. There was a link to prostitution and so on. It might have been that these people were poor and they had to survive without any welfare. So the eugenic ideology that the human population should be improved through social policies such as selective breeding, encouraging people with desirable traits to have children while encouraging those with undesirable traits not to, is a coercive ideology. Next slide. So there was a laboratory set up at University College, a first professorship in the world, but there was also one set up in the United States with the Cold Springs Harbor, funded by the Rockefellers, where Harry Laughlin took over, and they made a link with early psychologists who were perfecting or imperfecting IQ tests, and they linked these into testing people with learning difficulties. But they were also attacking those who were insane, criminalistic, epileptic, inebriates, alcoholics, diseased in all sorts of ways, but also, which is not known so much, blind, including seriously visually impaired, deaf, including seriously hearing impaired, deformed, including cripples, dependent, and ne'er-do-wells, tramps, and paupers. This was the list in Lauchlin's model law. By the way, he'd already applied this in Indiana to compulsory sterilization in 1907. By 1920, when he produced this, there were already 20 states in the United States who were operating compulsory sterilization and tests for people before they could get married. Adolf Hitler, who had been arrested for the beer hall putsch, had some time to read when he was in prison. He read about this stuff and he was very positive about it. And the list that he introduced in 1933 for sterilization is more or less this list. And the laboratories in Germany were also backed by these same capitalist forces. In fact, Ford was very positive about the anti-Semitic program of killing and getting rid of the Jews and supported all the way down. Kellogg and Rockefeller were also identified, and there were many others who did it as well. This is why we're concerned about these uncontrolled large business efforts that are running the world now without democratic control, because they can also bring in crackpot ideas, and in fact they are. Next. Right, so operating this eugenic program, we're nearly finished. So, of course, Nazi Germany, 400,000 sterilized against their will, 300,000 killed under the T4 program. USA, 70,000 in 34 states. This is mainly sterilization. Alberta, 3,200. And there in Canada, it was much linked with a much higher proportion of indigenous population. Sweden, 60,000. Denmark, 11,000. Japan, which actually started only after the Second World War, 1948 to 1996, 25,000 sterilized, with 16,000 without their consent. And there were many others, including places like Peru, which is very much attacking indigenous people, but also disabled people. Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Spain, and Italy, who also, of course, had a hangover of fascist governments. And so that was what was going on. Next slide. So then this is what happened, the Mental Deficiency Act. You were classed as idiots, imbecile, feeble-minded individuals and locked away. This is also why much of the population who had learning difficulties were deemed ineducable, because it was believed then that you couldn't change people's intellect. You couldn't teach the test. The brain was not plastic. It was fixed. All of those things have been proved to be wrong. So this was a great human rights abuse that happened to all of these people. And ironically, it was Enoch Powell, as Minister of Health, who decided that there were too many of these places, including all the asylums where mental health victims had been put, And so about 500,000 people were slowly brought out and care in the community, which of course worked reasonably well until austerity. And of course, it doesn't work very well at all now. Next. And the last thing I want to talk about is assisted dying, because of course we've seen this happening with Parliament at the moment being generally in favour, although there are more votes to be had. And in the Lords, there's a lot of amendments going on. And we need to hear more about those. So we have legislation creep across the countries that have brought it in. So far in Canada, where MAID is on, and many of you may have seen Liz Carr's excellent film she made for the BBC on that. You can now, if you, there are examples in the last few months of people who have depression or are homeless applying for being killed by the state under MAID, and they are being killed. And the same thing is happening in the Netherlands. So this creep is already, people are arguing that other groups who aren't just terminally ill should also have this. I'm not against morally. I know Christians and others are against suicide, but it's not a crime anymore. I believe people should be able to take their own lives if that's what they want. I think they should be counselled against it. But I don't believe the state should actually be doing the killing, because we've seen examples of the state doing the killing, and it is us as disabled people who are in the firing line. And when people say, well, it's about terminally ill people, well, many conditions that we have can be termed as terminally ill, anorexia for one. So this is not something that we should accept lightly. I think that's the last one, isn't it, Thomas, in this group of slides? Yes. Okay, so now we'll go on to our first film, which, of course, is from someone who's been carrying on the fight, the good fight in Parliament, Baroness Tanni Grey-Thompson, and I interviewed her last week to get her views both on what's happening generally and what's happening specifically around the assisted suicide, or assisted death as it's called. Thanks. Okay, I'm speaking to Dame Tanni Grey-Thompson, great sports person, but also in the Lords as a leader really for the opinions of disabled people. And first of all, here we are in 2025, a new government in post for 15 months, 16 months. How do you view the current time for disabled people? What are the positives and what are the possible threats?
2025 is a pretty difficult place for disabled people right now for a number of reasons. I think if we look at sort of historic wins in terms of accessibility, we're nowhere near where I hoped we'd be right now. I do a lot of work on public transport, and I say this all the time that trains were meant to be step free to the train by January the 1st, 2020. It's going to be 100 years before we hit that. So a massive failing from the Disability Discrimination Act. I have to say the Equality Act I don't think has served us an awful lot better, to be honest. And other legislation like legal aid, sentencing and punishment of offenders, LASPO, removed ability to get legal aid. So historically, a lot of success has come in terms of moving things forward for disabled people through the ability to sue. And as soon as you cut that, it slowed things down quite a lot. So I think it's a very challenging place. Just, education, healthcare, workforce, transport is pretty tough. But then you add that to the narrative of what is in the press about disabled people at the moment. And I think that makes it even harder. So austerity hit disabled people hard. But what we see at the moment is almost like the government trialing, and the Conservative government did this as well, trialing out changes to disability benefits in the media to see which gets most traction. So, they had to back down on looking at personal independence payment. And there's a lot in the press at the moment about Motability and what they might do to that. Although we don't have anything concrete, we're expecting it shortly. So a lot of the narrative around disability is about disabled people being scroungers, sucking money out the state, not contributing anything. And then you have the Paralympics where, for a little bit, disabled people, a very small group of disabled people are, told they're absolutely amazing. And I think it's really hard because we don't expect non-disabled people to live their lives through the lens of Olympians. But we expect disabled people to live their life through what a Paralympian can do. And, I talk about it passionately because I've been one, and I see it. So I think it's a tough place for disabled people, because disabled people do want to work and contribute, but there's barrier after barrier, and disability hate crime figures are appalling, but most of the time it gets lost. So I feel like I'm constantly, and others are trying to elbow in anything on legislation for disabled people, and the very sort of worrying thing for me, the only time we're actually really genuinely talking about equality is in the terminally ill adults bill, which, I find it incredibly sad if the only place that people are talking about equality of access is a bill which has the potential to kill people.
Mm. And that bill, I mean, what worries me from the broader historical sweep about that bill, it gives for the first time the state to power over our lives. Well, they have had that power before under the Mental Deficiency Act and other things, but not to actually kill us. In fact, there was even compulsory sterilisation was defeated in the House of Commons in 2011, I think, when Winston Churchill tried to bring it forward. But this seems to be just going forward on the back of the media, even though the vast majority of disabled people's organisations are opposed to it. So have we managed to get any amendments that weaken the threat to us in there?
So I've tabled a huge number of amendments around clarification of disability, and trying to put in safeguards. So we're told it's the safest bill in the world. That's not a very high bar to pass, to be honest. And we're told, it's not for disabled people. But we have to remember that anybody who's terminally ill actually would qualify as being disabled under the Equality Act. So, there's very fine lines in terms of, what that terminal condition could be. So I think we tend to think of it as, cancer, leukemia. But actually, if I got a pressure sore and it didn't heal, I would be terminal. Conditions like cystic fibrosis, MND, Duchenne's, they are all terminal. And that's, I don't think, what the public's thinking about. So there is one survey that I find from Dignity in Dying, which says that the majority of disabled people support this legislation, but that's self-ID. So we don't know what level of impairment an individual might have. There's between 300 and 400 deaf and disabled people's organisations. Not a single one supports this bill. And, when you look at wider surveys, people say they support it when you call it assisted dying. Actually, when you interrogate what people think they mean by assisted dying, they actually think it means palliative care. And then when you call it assisted suicide, it drops significantly. And then when you talk about what it actually means in terms of, somebody ending their life, the support falls even further. So I think it's a real challenge, because it sounds really simple. 2 doctors, settle wish, 6 months diagnosis. What's to argue with that? But the devil is absolutely in the detail. And we're constantly being told, it's not for disabled people. Lord Faulkner, in his commission report from, I think, 2011, said it's, and it was a different bill, similar, said, it's not meant for disabled people at this moment in time. So, there are already peers and MPs talking about wanting it to be wider than 6 months, a wider number of people being able to access it. And I do think, we're just being fobbed off. Over the weekend, I had a man, I'm not sure whether he's mansplaining or able-splaining or just being patronising to me, but he just said to me, well, it's not, it won't be for disabled people. Well, I'm really sorry, just because a non-disabled man tells me it's not, I'm not really sure I can believe it or get behind it. And, we're being told that we've got nothing to worry about. But actually, if you look at everything I've talked about in terms of how disabled people are treated in society, I think those lines get blurred very quickly, and it's difficult. So the amendments I'm putting in is a lot of data recording and safeguarding. I don't know how far it'll go, but the bill as it stands is absolutely not fit for purpose. Yeah, the people who support law change, started off, talking about Oregon and Holland, and then jumped on Canada until Canada went so far beyond what anyone thought. So, in Canada, you can request it for being homeless, for being poor, for having anorexia. Now, that's another condition. Anorexia is terminal, even though people don't want to think that it is, or, it can be at a certain point.
So the next one is Miro Griffiths, who's Dr. Miro Griffiths is at Leeds University, Associate Professor and Director of the Disability Studies Department there, which is the most prestigious disabilities studies department in the UK. And I think Miro has some very interesting things to say to us. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Richard, for having me. I think it's a really dangerous and precarious time because what you have is these constant narratives around the question of whether disabled people should live, and if they are going to live, then what level of support or intervention will be put in by the state or by community groups and so on. So what this comes down to is how disabled people's lives are valued. And I think, as you can see throughout history, there's been this constant question around should disabled people exist? And if they exist, what level of threshold does the state want to have in order to put those interventions in place to support people? So you're constantly trying to start from the position as a disabled person that's trying to argue that my life has legitimacy and it has value, rather than to flip this the other way around, which is to assume that all existing life is valuable and all existing life should be supported to participate in the spaces and the communities and in the societies that people want to negotiate and navigate around. But that to do that, it requires a sufficient level of support to meet the needs of the individual and meet the needs of the individual in relation to what they want to do. But the problem is, as we know from any of the data sets that we draw on, is to say people are experiencing inequality, they're experiencing injustice, they're experiencing a lack of sufficient social policy mechanisms, legislative protection mechanisms. So you're starting from the position of you're in a very precarious situation, your rights are being undermined, your entitlements are not there, even if they are articulated in the rhetoric or in the expected frameworks that provide the fundamental freedoms and the protections in the kind of languages and the discourses of the legislative framework. So if you're in a precarious situation and then you're facing all these difficult situations in everyday life, then of course people then start to question whether my life is tolerable. And I think this is the perfect example, which is seen in the assisted dying, or what I refer to as the assisted suicide debates. And you have this in the UK, you have this across the globe, and in many countries that have been debating it or passing it or rejecting this sort of intervention. And the problem that this creates is, on the one hand, it reveals the struggles of people to live their life. And quite understandably, people will feel that my life is intolerable because of the materiality of life, in terms of not having sufficient material to live your life the way you want to live and have protections. So, an accessible home, accessible space to maneuver around, the importance of financial resources and so on. You're also subjected to elements of attitude, in terms of people having the cultural and social expectations that being a disabled person is an undesirable way to live. The idea of receiving support is perceived as undesirable. The idea that, if you're not demonstrating self-sufficiency or individual responsibility or competitiveness, then you're seen as inadequate, or you're seen as almost subhuman. So you can understand that people are being constantly barricaded with lack of infrastructure or negative hostile attitudes, or lack of efficient support mechanisms by the state. And that leads people to question, well, do I want to live my life? Do I want to continue living? And then what you have is this real dangerous discussion around the state orientating its focus towards facilitating, or in my view, accelerating one's death, rather than building from the premise of the responsibility of the state is to provide opportunities for you to live the best life that you can and receive sufficient support to live the life that you can and live, survive, and flourish. So when you introduce something like assisted suicide, it completely destabilizes that, because it places the emphasis on, should you be supported to die by the state or by medical practitioners, when at the same time, simultaneously, you are living a life of injustice and exclusion and inequality. And for me, this creates a real dangerous situation, really, because what you have when we think about legislation and when we think about the role of the state, I think this is particularly important in the context of the right to life or death, is that you want there to be mechanisms of protection, which are designed to protect the collective pursuit of existence for the majority of people. Now, individuals can say, well, I want my autonomous right to end my life, and that's a completely understandable position to take. That's not really the question that's being debated, because the question that's being debated is, should the state have a role in doing that? And I think when you look at the history of how the state has behaved in terms of understanding disability, administrating disability, or thinking about disabled people's position in society, it's been one of extreme hostility and of a deep sense of scrutiny, where your ability to be supported is based on conditionality, it's based on sanctions, it's based on expectations of trying to engage in a notion of productivity in labor markets and so on. And so you're facing a situation where actually what you want the state to be engaged on is trying to build and imagine what are the best forms of participation and accessibility in all the different areas of life. So those who can work, they're supported to work in an accessible labor market that takes account of the nuances of accessibility. If you can't work, then you're supported to live a life of value and worthwhile participation and existence in your community. You receive healthcare, which is designed to meet your needs and understand how your body is changing in relation to the circumstances of your personal health conditions, as well as the social determinants that you're living in terms of the society that you live in. And so you want everything to be focused on how to support an individual, not place the question of, well, is your life worth living? And if we deem it not to be worth living, then we'll try to eradicate it.
Now under the rule of Donald Trump, where he stood against certain parts of wokeism, as he called it, but in fact he's now against entirely equality, diversity and inclusion, and it's having dramatic effects on many different groups in America. So does this signal to us really that the philosophical framework of the world is moving against us, and we have to do something more to win allies and supporters to defend what we have?
I think that's a really interesting point, because I suppose what it reveals is there is currently in the kind of popular discourses, there is a question about what is the role of the state, and then underlying that is this assumption of shrinking the state because it's seen as either being distrustful, it's being perceived as being inadequate, it's insufficient to meet need. But of course, the argument that many people put as a replacement to that is this kind of libertarian free market world of you just kind of persevere as best as you can, as long as you have opportunities to, pursue a very aggressive form of competition and survival, then let's just go with that. And I think this is where the problem then is, because of the lack of recognition towards the fact that, as you said, it's not a level playing field for everybody. And really, my view is that you want a quite imposing state infrastructure that is geared towards principles of accessibility, inclusivity, and participation. And everything that flows from that, whether that's in the context of designing an education system, designing a labor market, designing a healthcare system, and so on, it has to be predicated on those three principles. And that's why if you take something like the UNCRPD, the convention, what you have is, I think I remember Gerard Quinn talking about it, one of the former rapporteurs, is he would talk about it as a moral compass. It gives you a guidance towards where you want to get to.
Thanks. And we now go on to someone who's working at a much more micro level, an ally of the disabled people's movement. I first came across her more than 30 years ago when she was a speech and language therapist working with children with cerebral palsy that the education system was rejecting, to give them a voice through alternative and augmented communication and other methods. She's gone on now to do work with neurodiverse people, and her book, which she published earlier this year, How to Be and Remain a Compassionate Educator, I think is a good message. We will not do this on our own. We need allies throughout the system to help us and support us. We should be the ones as disabled people making the running, but we certainly need professionals to be helping us. So over to Anne.
you might remember that a very long time ago, I started out my professional life as a speech and language therapist, which gave me an interest in communication. But I kind of, over the years, I've moved away from that. I've worked a lot in schools. I've particularly worked alongside teachers and teaching assistants, doing training around individual children with a whole range of disabilities and neurodivergence. I've worked with adults, I've worked with residential social workers, with parents, and eventually I moved into academia and I became a researcher and a lecturer, with a particular focus on autism. And I'm still working as a lecturer on an MA for neurodiversity. But I also, about 6 years ago, decided to retrain, because my whole life has been acquiring different aspects within the field. So I trained as a counsellor. And so my current work, as well as lecturing, is as a counsellor for neurodivergent children. So the biggest learning point of all is that all people function best within a positive relationship, not within a disciplinarian, harsh system that doesn't leave flexibility. So all young people need to feel that they are liked, that they are cared for, that they are safe, that their strengths are valued. I think that this current system makes it very difficult for educators to do that, although I know that lots of brilliant people are working in schools and forming those roles, making those relationships. I think that one of the things that happens to young people very quickly is developing a sense of shame because of difference, and that's horrendous. They're born a particular way, their brain works a certain way, and because of that, they end up feeling lesser. We really need to challenge that. And I'm very passionate about educators understanding executive function skills. So understanding basic neuroscience about what happens in particular situations, how children learn, and the demands of a task. So I find in my experience that it can be very difficult for educators to understand the components of a task. So for example, lots and lots of neurodivergent people struggle with working memory. Working memory comes all the way through the school day. And if we understood that a lot of children within our class had that difficulty, and we did activities and practice and provided scaffolds to support them, then I think you would immediately see an improvement in inappropriate behaviour. I think that for a very long time, we've had a focus on labels, on diagnostic labels, on identifying children as being on the autistic spectrum or having ADHD. We know that our system in the UK is letting lots of people down because they're not getting diagnoses, long waiting lists. There was a report about it on the radio this morning about no more assessments for ADHD in some places. So I would like to say that you don't need to diagnose all the children. You don't need to be an expert in any particular diagnostic label. What you need to do is have this attitude to really deep understanding of a child. And I know that a lot of people might come back at me and say, how do we do that? We've got 30 children in every class. I think it could be built into the curriculum, particularly early years curriculum. So we are constantly building and updating profiles of children that tell us about their particular cognitive processes. So what they will be able to learn independently, what they will be able to learn with a certain level of support. It's going back to Vygotsky and all of his ideas and the zone of proximal development. What children, we need to see what they can do on their own. What we are finding is that more and more children could be considered neurodivergent. So we are really, myself, my students, we're really querying, is there such a thing as neurotypical? And this is why when I wrote my book, the point was, look at the children who we know are very different in their ways of being and their ways of learning. learn about them, learn from them, and apply across the board. So I would like to see 30 children with profiles of how they are, with a tolerance of every single person, because it isn't an us and them. It's not that they're the table that go and sit over there because they're all a little bit different. It's right now we are doing maths. We've got to organize the tables by who has got a really great working memory that can help their peer who has a great cognitive flexibility, for example, or creative approach to this.
Okay, and your book, your recent book, was entitled How to Be and Remain a Compassionate Educator. How would you define a compassionate educator?
Somebody who loves going to work, really enjoys the children, really enjoys helping them to learn, and who constantly reminds themselves this child is doing their best. How can I now support them when this best is disruptive, or when they're showing distress? How can I be there for that child? So in this wonderful school that I have in my head, which I think exists, at least components exist in lots of places, then a lot of the focus would be on children learning how they best learn, and children self-advocating for the tools they need to tackle a task. So I have an imaginary toolbox, a set of resources that students become very well versed in the sort of scaffold that they need for a particular task. They go off and get it. If it's a physical resource, they sit on the table where it's available. They meet with the peer that's good at already at doing that. But what you need to be able to do is be critical of that knowledge, to check it, to think about the implications of it, to apply it. And I don't think our system is set up for that. But if we are really helping students to understand how they best learn and how they best approach life, because that's what it is, then that's what I would want the government to be focusing on, is how do we bring those skills in.
If we can have the next one, which is, while you're queuing it up, I'll introduce her, is Sarah Kilpatrick, who is the newly elected Assistant General Secretary or Deputy General Secretary of the National Education Union. She's only just been elected. She was a former art student in the Northeast, art teacher in the Northeast for 17 years. And before that, she was president last year of the National Education Union, which is the largest teachers and union, but also of head teachers and support workers who work in schools, more than 500,000, and is really a progressive union. And she'll explain how they relate to these different issues, which were queued up very well by Anne. Over to Sarah.
The more visible disabled people are, the more inclusive society becomes. And unless we have inclusivity built into the curriculum, then there will always be an element of people not necessarily being there, you know, as open as they could be in their workplace. So we have 12,000 teachers and support staff registered as disabled in the National Education Union, but we know that many more will be disabled, but they're afraid of discrimination in the workplace. They are concerned about what could happen with their employer, and they therefore don't want to declare it to their employer, so it's not declared to their trade union either. I think those sort of things are really problematic in building a sense of inclusivity. And so the union have a really great resource called The Full Story, which is a set of approved children's books which really highlight an inclusive nature for disabled people. So they're very early years all the way through to, you know, bigger chapter books that Key Stage 2 and 3 children would be reading. And it's the normalization of the variety that we represent in humanity, that there is an enormous range of people and abilities, and we should be seeing all of that represented, not just in our lives, in society, in our workplaces, but also in the curriculum.
Many of them have sort of ended up under the current Mr. Gove plus curriculum, not being able to show what they can do. So how can the arts help with that?
Well, I mean, you know, as I should say a former art teacher now, shouldn't I? But as an art teacher, I have been a huge advocate for the arts in schools, not just fine art, not just visual arts, music, drama, dance, you know, all forms of creativity and creative expression should be central to our curriculum. What we've seen since Michael Gove and Nick Gibbs' reforms to education have been, I mean, obviously issues in society in a broader sense as well. What they did came at the same time as the changes brought through the austerity budgets. So the closure of sure starts and public libraries, and many art centres were shut down as a result of that coalition government's agenda. But what we have seen in schools is a real deterioration in children's mental health. We've seen real problems with attendance in schools. Children are not happy in school. Children are not attending school. There are enormous and growing problems. And I think that in part is because of this high stakes, highly pressured environment that schools have become, that the idea that, you know, we have this exam factory culture, it doesn't exclude everybody equally. And there are children who will really struggle for various reasons, socially as well as in terms of their health. But some neurodivergent children won't cope as well without those moments in the day where they can be creative, where they can express themselves. Not everybody can sit still for an hour at a time and just take in knowledge and reproduce it. I think the arts are absolutely vital for everybody's health and well-being and everybody's education and understanding of the world. Well, we have produced a range of resources, but the disability, the Disabled Educators Toolkit, we have built a degree of understanding about the social model of disability, the idea that actually, you know, what you have in terms of barriers is not because of your disability, it is because of society. And those barriers are something that should be removed by society. It is not something that, you know, you need to work around or you need to accept. That is the sort of thing that we should be working together to eradicate, so that disabled people can take as full a part in life as they would wish. We've got huge concerns about the government's proposals regarding access to work the pathways to work report that they've done. And we know that our members have benefited in huge ways from the access to work support, the personal independence payments, and they're the reason that many of our members stay in work. So we know that, you know, we did a survey earlier this year, and we know that people have used their PIP payments for things like being able to work part-time and remain in work, to, you know, get taxis to and from work, you know, equipment that assists them with their daily life, and that their access to work, the access to work scheme has enabled them to do things like have accessible whiteboard and adaptable tables, smartboard, extendable pens. There are huge benefit to engaging with our disabled members and finding out exactly what is needed to make work, you know, acceptable, accessible, enjoyable to them. But we've got a huge crisis in recruitment and retention, and the government's focus should be on making work accessible and enjoyable for everybody. And like I was saying before about representation, and building an inclusive society, we want to see our disabled members in the classroom. We want to see disabled members being visible to their colleagues and to their students. I think there are a lot of people amongst our membership who fought for a Labour government. There are a lot of people amongst our members who hoped for a Labour government. They hoped for an improvement in our working lives, in our terms and conditions of employment, in funding for education, in funding for SEND. We're not seeing any of that. And the hardships imposed by the coalition government and then the successive Conservative-led governments since were brutal and have caused a legacy of harm that we will take a generation to try and rebuild. But in order to try and rebuild it, we need the government to be on side with us, and we need the government to actually take action. So when the first things that they did were to impoverish elderly people and then to attack disabled people's rights, that was really astonishing and bitterly, bitterly disappointing. So the National Education Union has written a response about the Pathways to Work proposals. I don't know if I can call them proposals, but we used information from the working life of our disabled members. There is a broader attack here. I mean, we're looking at children who aren't getting the help that they require. We're not children who aren't having the support that they need. And we are living in a society that is really unfair. And when the government don't make steps to redress that balance, then it's our responsibility, not just as a trade union, but as a social justice campaign network, to call that out.
So our next speaker, Lizzie, can you cut your camera off because you're right on across the screen? Thank you. Yes, Thomas, can we go on now to Simone Aspis? And Simone is the Free Our People Now campaign manager based at Inclusion London. And I had a really interesting chat with Simone last week. I was drawn to this campaign because unless you go into it, you don't even know that there are a large number of people still with on the autistic spectrum, people with learning difficulties who are being locked away against their will. And that's what this campaign is about. So Simone, tell us all about the campaign and what you've achieved.
So it's the only national campaign that's led by people with learning difficulties and autistic people to seek the ending of inappropriate detention on the grounds of disability. We are a network of organisations and individuals who are led, who identify as having learning difficulties or autistic and are doing good campaign work locally. We've come together to raise our voices at a national level in order to get our voices heard regards to this very important issue around getting people out of hospitals. Our network started off in 2024, beginning with a manifesto that had 3 very important asks. The first ask is around co-production of services, having a voice, because without a voice, then nothing can be done in a productive way. Mm-hmm. We can see what's happened. You know, lots of services have been developed without any engagement with us, and they've been very disastrous. The second ask that we have is around the design of services and support and the ending of institutionalisation in line of the UNCRPD Article 19, the rights to independent living. Mm-hmm. But we are talking about the government's compliance with the UNCRPD. And then the third demand is about having stronger protections and stronger safeguards and really stronger punishments for hospitals who've been found wanting in abusing people with learning difficulties and autistic people.
So many people would have thought once we'd had care in the community and all those long stay hospitals were closed down and people came out, that the problem was solved, but clearly it's not. Why are there still people in these institutions, particularly those with learning difficulty and autistic people?
The problem we've got at the moment is that people with learning difficulties and autistic people do not have the right to the support to live in the community. They don't have right to education, health and social care and housing. Often this leads to people with learning difficulties and autistic people being unsupported at home with or without their families. And often they're only brought to the attention of the authorities when there is a big crisis, and then they end up being in hospital. The way our funding system works is that once you're detained under the Mental Health Act, your placement gets funded. Obviously, and therefore that's where the big issue is. Also, that there is still a sense of that some people still have the right to live in the community and some people don't. The Mental Health Act makes it quite clear that people with learning difficulties and autistic people can still be detained on the grounds of being disabled, i.e. having a learning difficulties or autistic. There's no other group that can be detained by the state without committing a crime, without a proper court trial. And therefore there is clearly some discrimination going on here.
You've identified the problem. What's the scale of the problem? How many people does this actually affect, both adults and young people?
What we do know is there's over 2,000 people who are detained under the Mental Health Act. This does not include the many people with learning and autistic who are detained under the Mental Capacity Act, because there's no statistics, and those who are informally placed in hospitals, but that could be, as far as we're concerned, detention anyway. The mental health bill that the government have put through, the mental health bill, the government said is going to make things better for people with learning difficulties and autistic people. They think that just removing people with learning difficulties and autistic people out of section 3, which is the treatment section, will mean that people with learning difficulties and autistic people will not end up being treated under the Mental Health Act. However, what we do know is that people with learning difficulties and autistic people will still end up being detained under section 2, which is assessment, and underneath section 31 and 41, which is around the criminal justice route, and they can still be detained under the Mental Capacity Act. So the deep concerns that we have is that people with learning difficulties and autistic people will end up being detained through the criminal justice route or the Mental Capacity Act route. When the bill went to the House of Commons, we did have Jane Craft, who is the All Parliamentary Group for people with learning difficulties, who had asked the minister about his engagement with people with learning difficulties and autistic people. I so happened to make sure I was there, so Stephen Kinnock had to look me in the eye. And that was when we first had our commitment to make sure to have a commitment that he said that on record that any policy that involves getting people out of hospital, it ain't going to happen unless we actually engage with people with learning and autistic people. Obviously now with the bill actually now coming to the end, we now need to see the proof in the pudding's in the eating, and we'll be absolutely pursuing that action regards to when the code of practice is in there, is been published, and also when various conversations about a road plan, a roadmap about moving people out of hospitals, then we're going to make sure that we're right there from the beginning. If you're somebody who identifies as having learning difficulties or who is autistic, who would love to join our network, find out more about our campaign work, then please contact Inclusion London. We would love to hear from anybody who would like to support our work in getting our voices heard. We would like to hear from ICB boards who are interested in wanting to work with us to develop strategic plans to move people out of hospitals. And we would love to work with lawyers. We desperately need for lawyers to work with our communities, because there's people, learning autistic people, who are stuck in hospitals or are struggling to get their voices heard. And we're really quite keen to work with lawyers to take that work forward with us.
So that's the contact details up on the screen now. And if we can now go to Rachel Charlton-Dailey, who was part of the group that got the Taking the Pip campaign going, which certainly put pressure on Keir Starmer as well as his government. But of course, there were many thousands of disabled people who reacted to the government's ridiculous ideas and actually lies by confusing different sorts of benefits, thought they might squeeze something through, but they didn't. So let's hear from Rachel.
So I've been writing about disability for a long time. I'm primarily a journalist and a writer. I've been writing about it, as you say, I was writing about it from my own experiences. I did a lot of opinion stuff, and a lot of that was around my specific conditions. But then it was probably when COVID hit, I started writing more about how the disabled community were affected, and I was finding it harder and harder to get stories that were really about just how much the disabled community were being hit by COVID. And because the media just had moved on, you know, once we got to 2000, like the end of 2020 and the beginning of 2021, everybody was more focused on being able to go to pubs and being able to see their friends, which I understand, but you know, that was at the same time that we were seeing the highest death rates for disabled people. Off the back of that, I started my own publication, The Unwritten, which sadly just is taking a massive extended hiatus because I just haven't got the energy to do that anymore. But it was a space for disabled people to tell their own stories in their own words without it being twisted and pulled on this narrative of either the pity or the inspiration. And then what really inspired me to learn more about the disability history side of it was I did an event with Barbara Lisicki, who of course is a bloody legend. But I realised whilst I was hosting this event and talking to Barbara that I didn't really know huge amounts of what had happened beyond what I'd seen in the film about the campaigning that Barbara met Ellen. And I was like, I was 6 when this happened. How is this something that I have never been taught about? We decided to try and put together a book, and through that I learnt so much, you know, like things that I thought I knew, but like learnt so much more about them. And then off the back of that, I started getting more and more into campaigning myself. It was really funny that you mentioned the book, because I literally finished writing the book the day before Liz Kendall announced all of the benefits cuts, and I went, oh, we've got a whole new book to write. Me and Sherry Lee and a few others, we got together and we went, okay, we've got to do something about this. And there were already campaigns happening in the background. There were already, well, not in the background, but campaigns that hadn't made it to the mainstream. So DPAC were doing a lot of things. There was things like Crips Against Cuts were starting up at the same time as we were starting. And all of these things were happening, but it wasn't in the mainstream consciousness. So we knew that as especially Sherry Lee and other people who were on the campaign were in the public eye, and even to myself to a very small extent were in the public eye. We knew that we had a really unique opportunity here to bring this to people who wouldn't necessarily be involved in campaigning, because the things like, you know, obviously the things that Deepak and Inclusion London and a lot of other incredible places have done, whilst it's effective, it very rarely brings it to the mainstream. So what we wanted to do was, because we knew that we knew a lot of other disabled people in the public eye, we knew that the best way to do this was to do something as big as a open letter to Keir Starmer and Liz Kendall and Rachel Reeves, and to say we really, really need you to stop this, but at the same time to also introduce an online template for other people to write to their MPs and to get that rolling, you know, to make sure people were constantly on at their MPs. And we had letter templates, we had all of the different ways you could be involved. We had a tracker that enabled you to send your email to your MP in one quick click. And it was really about just getting the awareness out there. Like, we do count ourselves as part of the reason that the big rebellion happened, because we were the ones that got the awareness out there.
What the government managed to do was to collate that and confuse it with disability benefits when you were out of work, whereas actually this was a non-means tested benefit for anyone, whether you're in work or not, for the extra cost of it. And I'm not sure that's been clearly understood by people. I think they withdrew it because there was too much opposition, but I think they'll come back on that because.
Well, I think that's deliberate. You know, they want people to confuse the benefits you get, that you can get if you work or not, with the benefits you only get if you don't work, because that way they can go, oh, look at all these lazy scroungers.
Yeah.
Something that the government did in collusion with the media, and it's something that became very clear as I was writing my book, that started with Thatcher and oh God, what was her Peter Lilly. Like, it started with people like Thatcher and Peter Lilly, and it just kept going and going and going. And one thing that it was very clear to me as I was writing this book was just how insipid it has been, like how deliberate all of this, because there's a whole chapter about the media narrative and the way politics shaped the media narrative, and it's very clear when you have it all lined together how they can go from these people who are all lazy scroungers to assisted dying.
But how do you see the quality of our lives going into the future? What have you learned from both the campaign and the book that we have to do to ensure that we have a decent life as disabled people?
It's scary, I'm not gonna lie. Like, it's really scary seeing where we're headed, especially with the media narrative. But I think more than anything, we've got to stick together. We've got to stick together. The disabled community is only so strong because we are such a tight-knit community who sticks together, who makes sure that, like, nobody gets left behind, who fights for everything we believe in. And it's one of those things where I will hold my hands up, you know, with PIP, we let universal credit go a bit too easily compared to how much of a fight there was for PIP. So we now need to fight just as hard for things like universal credit and everything else that is going to come as well.
How do you see the role of the internet and getting information out there in that role of educating the public?
It's a really tough question, because, like, the places like the mainstream media have got such a higher authority than individuals. But I think we have just got to keep trying. We've got to keep running campaigns that focus on, although we shouldn't still be having to focus on awareness, we've got to keep running the campaigns that focus purely on the facts and the awareness and say, look, this is what's going to happen. It's not hyperbole. People are going to die if you don't support us, and you keep voting these horrible politicians who don't care about us. We've got to really, really appeal to them, because a lot of the public, for all they believe all of this horrible claptrap, a lot of the public have disabled members of their family. We've got to take it to them. We've got to go, this is going to happen to your auntie, to your nana, to your mum. Like, do you know
themselves down the track?
to
It can happen to
yourself?
anybody, can't it?
Eventually, it's going to happen to you. You know, like
Yeah.
it's awful that we still have to do that, but we really do. We have to meet people where they are.
So if you want to read more of what Rachel writes, she writes regularly in the Canary, which is a good source of alternative news, not doctored by the big media houses. Let's go on to a young person's point of view. We're going to hear from Yewande Akintelu, who is the youth manager, ALLFIE, the Alliance for Inclusive Education, running a project called Our Voice, and is the youth officer there. So let's hear from her. I'll tell you what we're going to do to get to the end time, but also we'll keep going for another 8 minutes afterwards for those who want to stay online. But after this, I'll tell you that. Okay. How does learning about social and human rights approach to disability make you feel more liberated as a disabled young person?
It makes me feel more liberated because I have been able to respond to disableism through learning about the social model. Learning about intersectionality has also enabled my understanding of how different oppressions come together and influence each other. I've also learned how powerful my lived experience is in order to be able to influence and create change. So all of these approaches have shaped my liberation as a Black disabled woman campaigning for inclusive education. This approach shows that our oppression is a shared experience and we can provide each other with peer support. We can build solidarity through shared experiences of oppression. We are able to give language to name this oppression and name the barriers. And then we can recognize disableism as a systemic injustice rather than an individual issue. The approach also provides a collective voice so that disabled people can mobilize, speak for themselves. And when we can speak for ourselves, we're able to demand for rights, dignity, and we're able to change the narrative.
Okay. So in the past, many disabled people, Black and white, were not allowed to live freely or even be born. Why is life better now for disabled people, and what things could put that progress at risk, do you think?
So the reasons why life is better now is because we recognize the progress that disabled people have campaigned for, although there remains much more work to be done. That's why, in part, we have created the Our Voice project for young disabled people to be able to lead, campaign, and influence decision-making and policy. We have legal protections such as the Children and Families Act, the Equality Act, international treaties such as the UNCRPD and the UN Conventions for the Rights of the Child. We have DPOs that are able to build solidarity and demand for rights and justice, and DPOs also create support and leadership of disabled people. And now we also have disabled people in central government, such as Baroness Jane Campbell, Baroness Tanni Grey-Thompson, and Marsha de Cordova MP. The things that could put this progress at risk include cuts to disability benefits, cuts to social security, and cuts to social care. And there's also an anti-immigration agenda, which is happening at the moment with specific attacks on Black and global majority people and attacks on disabled people with an agenda to reduce the central government budget, which is being spent on disabled people.
So quite a lot of threats possible. In the past, eugenics was a very harmful idea that treated disabled people as less than and othered. How do you think it affected the way disabled children were treated in schools way back then?
So we can see the effects because it resulted in segregation and institutionalization of disabled people, and the idea that disabled people should be separated from the rest of society. And this led to disabled people experiencing segregated schooling and complete exclusion from the mainstream, from the education system, and exclusion from interacting with non-disabled people. It also resulted in low expectations of disabled people and denying us opportunities. It led to us being given harmful labels, harmful treatment, and categorizing disabled people. It silenced and devalued our voices, which creates for us internalized stigma that some lives are less worthy than others.
As part of our voices, ALLFIE's campaign for inclusive education, how do you think this history still shapes the way disabled children are treated in education today?
Well, we can still see it in the way the education system operates today. The education system is still replicating the points we discussed in the previous question. Through the increase in segregation in special schools and SEND units, which keep reinforcing the idea that disabled children and young people don't belong in mainstream spaces. We keep having low expectation and bias towards disabled people, which increases further if you're from marginalized communities, such as the traveler community, if you're from a migrant background, or if you're from an under-resourced family background. Disabled children and young people are largely excluded from decision-making about their education as well. And there also continues to be a lack of resourcing, accountability, and training for mainstream schools. And we still have the idea that inclusive education is too hard, too expensive, or just not possible.
Okay, very topical. And so what do you think we can do to end segregation, isolation, and the harm in education systems and make schools fully inclusive for everyone? Because the government have just held back their white paper, but it was meant to give us their ideas about how to do that. So maybe now's an opportunity for people like you to say how they should do that. How can we have more inclusion?
Well, I would encourage everyone to look, research, read, and sign up to ALLFIE's manifesto, which we updated in 2024. And it sets out our 6 demands for inclusive education. And it shows what we need in order to achieve an inclusive education system. So I'll read the 6 demands out. So the first demand is to adopt an inclusive education legislation in the UK. Demand number 2 is to end all forms of segregated education. Demand number 3 is to redirect government SEND funding towards supporting and improving mainstream services. Demand number 4 is to end all forms of curriculum and assessment systemic injustice. Demand number 5 is to make inclusive education training mandatory nationwide. And demand number 6 is to combat social injustice in education.
So that's where you can get more information and get hold of Yewande to come. Certainly an excellent presentation. Now, the clock is going against us. I know some people will need to leave, but we're going to go on till 10 past, if that's all right. So we'll now hear from Stephen Lee Hodgkinson, who's a neurodiverse activist and an artist and has really been a facilitator. And he's going to tell us about a project he did of doing a disability history line from his perspective. And then I've got a couple of minutes comments before we wind up. I'm sorry that there isn't more time for discussion. Maybe we should make it for 2 hours next year, because I think there are an awful lot of issues that have been raised here, but lots of food for thought. Over to Stephen.
it's really important that we keep looking at disability history and disabled people's histories, because there's so much rich stuff that we've not really kind of discovered and celebrated. So the piece I'm going to share with you first of all is something that this is a piece that I made for Action on Disability, Hammersmith and Fulham, or even more, for Inclusion London, and it's a timeline of some history and politics relating to disabled people, and it's got a kind of bit of a spoken word that goes down the middle. There's some old evidence that you know, there were kind of disabled cave people. I think there's some bones found where people were seen to be caring for each other, and then I live in York now, so kind of there is a local legend relating to Ivor the Boneless, who apparently was a very sort of famous a fearsome warrior who kind of led the invasion into England. Following on from that, you get kind of the Poor Laws, and another book which is really significant, I think, that represents something quite interesting about disability, is the Malus Maleficarium, which is, or I think it's called the Devil's Hammer. It translates to the Devil's Hammer, and it was kind of the witchfinder's manual. And sort of some people have looked at this and they've ascribed sort of various symptoms relating to mental health, perhaps neurodiversity in that, and it reflects a time where difference was being seen as demon-like and devil. Quite interesting is some of the names of the early sort of political pieces of legislation. So in 1700s, you get the Madhouse Act, which was a kind of an early attempt at regulation, because so you had a lot of like private care homes, but they were called private lunatic asylums. And then following that, in the 1800s, you get the Lunacy Act, and then I think after that you get the Idiots Act, and the Lunacy Act was about kind of what we think of today as a sort of around an early form of mental health legislation. You can find in archives books that relate to this that were noting down the register of lunatics and idiots, and the term lunatic and idiot get separated, and so following this you get the Idiots Act as well. Later 1800s, you start getting sort of radical activity by disabled people, although I presume there must have been much before that. So you've got the National League of the Blind being formed as a trade union, and there are some early examples of kind of protests coming from groups of visually impaired workers, I think. Obviously, there's the T4 project as we come into the 1900s in the Second World War. Actually, I went to Berlin this year and I did see some exhibitions and some information about that. I think there is a real honesty being told about kind of what happened there. And the interesting thing about that I took away from that moment, and this is something that I think we need to explore more, is the link to, so you can kind of think that was isolated to Germany, but the ideas were about eugenics, and they were about kind of cleaning up society and kind of wanting to make wanting to do away with the kind of people who didn't fit the mold. See, as you read within the sort of broadsheets that Disability History Month has produced, the idea of kind of eugenics being a more kind of global phenomenon, with people like Virginia Woolf and Nora Fry and and Winston Churchill, Aldous Huxley, all kind of be proponents of D.H. Lawrence, being proponents of a eugenics movement, and I think this is something that's quite significant for disabled people and disabled people's history, in that we need to understand a bit more about what impact that's had, not just on us as disabled people, but on the whole way that we see ourselves in society today, in that we've kind of internalized this need to be kind of achievers and samey and average, and we've kind of disrespected the thing that is inevitable, which is that our bodies and minds are mainly more diverse. And one book that I think that's a really interesting book is this book by Paul Hunn, called Stigma, The Experience of Disability. Now, it's Paul Hunt was somebody that was kind of involved in, I think, laying out the kind of paving the way for direct payments and independent living support. And I understand it, he was like living in a care home essentially, and he said, like, I shouldn't be here. If I was kind of supported to live in the community, then I could work and contribute and you know, this and live as a citizen type thing. So that was that was quite significant. And then following around that time as well, you get the social model of disability being articulated, Sisters Against Disablement, and Centres for Independent Living. And then we see a kind of a bit more of a rise and a buzz around kind of being proud about disabled people's movement and other organisations' development, and there being kind of a council of disabled people. There was a lot of investment and effort put into kind of peer learning from disabled people to other disabled people about kind of this broader concept of human rights and disabled people's identity and the barriers that disabled people face. We still have an active disabled people's movement, and we have kind of organised responses to and vocal people speaking out against kind of cuts to changes around things like PIP and other welfare benefits, and then obviously recently the stuff around the assisted suicide bill. So this piece is called Disabled People's Equality, Some History and Politics. Our history is characterised by discrimination, but we have developed a unique culture of pride. With a diverse voice, we speak out, yet we don't enjoy full human rights. Experts in access, we protest together. Our goal is to achieve independent living. Oh, and now I just need to move you down there, because inclusion benefits everyone. That's what I would say about that.
Yeah. So thank you, Stephen, for that. It was very useful, and I think it was good to get a different take on it. It shows that our movement, regardless of our different impairments, we can learn from each other and take forward the history from those who went before, and we're going to need it in challenging. If I can put up my last slide, which is what we're going to need from all of this. Well, clearly we need higher taxation, especially from those more able to pay. One of the reasons why all these cutbacks are happening is because we aren't taxing people enough. You know, if we look at the places in Europe where there is a decent welfare state, such as in Scandinavia, people decide to have taxation at around 60% because that's what you need. And it actually saves you money because you don't have to have private health insurance and all the rest of it. So we have to win that battle, and we have to force the billionaires who are stationed in Britain and sucking off everybody else that they have to pay. In fact, some of them have said they will pay more, but the government aren't even taking that on. We have to stop the obscene attacks on disabled people in the media that are a continual part of the diet we have today. We need to calibrate welfare payments to the level of the minimum wage. Why should there be this minimum wage and then it not being given to people who are on welfare benefits, which are far below that level? We need to give payments for the extra costs of mobility and living. And this is what Liz Kendall got wrong, because she conflated that with the idea that it was benefits when you're out of work. This was not. It was brought in by Mrs. Thatcher based on a census that demonstrated that it cost 40% more to live your life and pay for it. And that's the figure I quoted of 1,070 a month that Scope have found out. We need to enforce the legislation we've got. We've got the Disability Discrimination Act as incorporated in the Equality Act. It's meant to apply to work, services, entertainment and education. It doesn't, and those who break it are not held to account. Things could change just by doing that. We've just been disappointed with the curriculum and assessment review run by someone who wasn't sympathetic to the sort of changes we want, like disability in the curriculum, anti-racism in the curriculum and so on. And even though they pointed to a change, a gap between disabled and non-disabled kids of 50% in achievement, they make no concrete suggestions of how to change that. We need to fine employers for not employing disabled people, not pathways to work. Deal with the employers. There's more than 1 million disabled people want to work. It's the employers who stop us working. They don't want us. They need to be fined, and they need to be forced to take people on. We are a reliable workforce, and we can do the job better because we are fearful of losing it. Government needs to use the media to challenge stereotypes. They're meant to under Article 8, and they don't. In fact, they whip them up. Change the assessment system that has its roots in eugenics to a formative approach. It was interesting that Sarah talked about this culture, this exam factory culture in our schools and colleges. That has its roots in educational psychologists, if you can call them that, like Cyril Burt, who sat on the committee that brought in the 11 plus and are not the SATs, a pale shadow of the 11 plus. It's eugenics testing by another name. We need to move away from that to a much more varied approach, as several speakers have said. We need to encourage collaboration and inclusion and oppose competition. After all, that's what we're going to need to survive as a human race, as we can see by the challenges coming out of COP30. This is the right way to go. What the problem is the plutocrats and monopoly capitalists who are running the world and are now taking over the seats of power have a different idea. They would rather gamble with human life and all humanity. And we have to build a wider movement to challenge them. But we also have to build our own movement to challenge disableist bullying and hate crime on the streets. And we must now really get the UNCRPD incorporated in British law. Both the Welsh and Scottish parliaments are committed to this. It is the English parliament that is not, and yet they hold the trump cards on equality legislation. So it's a mixed picture as we come into Disability History Month. I hope people will use these resources, and there'll be many more going up on our website in the next week, to actually hold local meetings where you work, discussions in union groups, community groups, student unions, in schools, assemblies, and working class. Up between now and the end of term, the 20th of December, there is plenty that can be done, and we will publicise any meetings and events that are open to the public on our website. So I'd like to thank everybody for coming. I think we've had a rich mixture of presentations, which certainly show three things. The disability movement is alive and well. It has had its successes, but we have much more to face as we go forward. So I'd like to thank everybody for coming. Thank you very much.